Have you ever heard of a rebellion so controversial that its own country tried to forget it for decades? A war that reshaped an empire, but whose heroes were branded as villains. Today, we're diving deep into the complex and often misunderstood story of the Mau Mau Uprising in Kenya. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a story of freedom, sacrifice, and a legacy that still echoes through Kenya today. The year is 1952. The British Kenya colony is a land of stark contrasts. On one side, European settlers enjoy vast, fertile lands. On the other, the native Kenyan population, particularly the Kikuyu, Meru, and Embu peoples, have been pushed onto smaller, less productive reserves. Tensions have been simmering for decades over land ownership, economic inequality, and a lack of political representation. The main political body, the Kenya African Union, or KAU, has been pushing for peaceful reform, but for many, progress is painfully slow, frustration is reaching a boiling point. From this fertile ground of discontent, a militant movement emerges, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, known to the world as the Mau Mau. This was no ordinary army. It was a secret society bound by powerful oaths, with its fighters drawn mainly from the Kikuyu, but also including Meru, Embu, Kamba, and Maasai warriors. Their goal was clear: to reclaim their ancestral lands and drive the British out of Kenya, by force if necessary. They saw armed struggle as the only path left to them, a last resort against an oppressive colonial system that refused to listen. The British response was swift and brutal. In October 1952, they declared a state of emergency. This wasn't just a military operation, it was a massive counterinsurgency campaign. The British Army, alongside the local Kenya regiment composed of white settlers and pro-British Kenyans, was deployed to crush the rebellion. What followed was a brutal conflict. The Mau Mau, operating from the dense forests of the Aberdare Ranges and Mount Kenya, waged a guerrilla war. They targeted colonial infrastructure, European-owned farms, and, significantly, fellow Kikuyu who they deemed loyalists or collaborators with the colonial government. The colonial government's tactics were equally harsh. They implemented mass arrests, forced relocations of civilians into fortified villages, and established a network of detention camps. These camps became notorious for their brutal conditions, where systematic torture and abuse were rampant. The conflict tore Kenyan society apart, pitting neighbor against neighbor and family member against family member. It was a deeply divisive and painful period, often characterized as a civil war within the Kikuyu community itself as much as a war against the British. The turning point in the military conflict came on October 21, 1956. Deep in the forest, a patrol captured the charismatic and strategic leader of the Mau Mau, Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi. His capture and subsequent execution were a massive blow to the rebellion's morale and operational capacity. For the British, this signaled the effective end of the war. The main fighting was over, and they declared victory. But was it truly over? While the capture of Kimathi broke the back of the rebellion in the Central Highlands, the spirit of resistance was not entirely extinguished. In other regions, particularly among the Meru people, guerrilla units led by figures like Field Marshal Musa Wariyama and General Baymunji continued their fight. They held out in the forests, a persistent symbol of defiance, even as Kenya moved towards independence. Tragically, leaders like General Baymunji were killed shortly after Kenya finally achieved self-rule in 1963, a bitter end to their long struggle. With independence achieved, you might think the Mau Mau fighters would be celebrated as national heroes. But the reality was far more complicated. Kenya's first president, Jomo Kenyatta, who had been imprisoned by the British for allegedly masterminding the rebellion, took a surprising stance upon taking power. He publicly denounced the Mau Mau, famously calling it a disease which had been eradicated and must never be remembered again. He urged Kenyans to forget the past and move forward in a spirit of reconciliation, saying, "We must have no hatred towards one another." Why would the new government distance itself from the very movement that many believed paved the way for freedom? The answer lies in the complex politics of post-colonial Kenya. Kenya's government sought to build a stable, unified nation. This meant including many of the so-called loyalists, Kenyans who had collaborated with the British and opposed the Mau Mau impositions of power and influence. Celebrating the Mau Mau would have alienated this powerful group and potentially destabilized the new nation. So, for decades, the story of the Mau Mau was officially silenced, suppressed from public discussion, and erased from school textbooks. The veterans of the Forest War were largely forgotten, living in poverty and obscurity while a new elite, some of whom had opposed them, prospered. But you can't erase history forever. While the government tried to bury the memory of the Mau Mau, opposition groups and academics kept the story alive. They saw the Mau Mau not as a tribalistic disease, but as the true, radical heart of the independence movement. They argued that it was the Mau Mau's violent sacrifice that ultimately forced Britain's hand, proving that colonial rule was unsustainable. This created a fierce debate that continues in Kenya to this day. Was the Mau Mau a necessary catalyst for independence, or a violent detour from a more peaceful path? Were they freedom fighters for all Kenyans, or a chauvinistic movement focused on one ethnic group? Did their sacrifice get stolen by a political class that feared their radicalism? These are not easy questions, and they don't have simple answers. The Mau Mau Uprising was a messy, complex, and painful chapter in history. It was a story of desperate people fighting for their land and dignity, a story of colonial brutality, and a story of a civil conflict that left deep scars. In recent years, the tide has begun to turn. In 2003, the Kenyan government officially lifted the ban on the Mau Mau, recognizing them as national heroes. In 2013, the British government issued a formal apology for the torture and abuse that occurred during the emergency and agreed to a multi-million-pound compensation settlement for thousands of elderly survivors. The silence has been broken, and the stories of the men and women who fought in the forests are finally being told. The legacy of the Mau Mau is a powerful reminder that history is rarely black and white. It teaches us about the brutal cost of colonialism, the difficult choices faced by those fighting for freedom, and how the narrative of history is often written by the victors. It's a story that was almost lost, but one that is essential for understanding the birth of modern Kenya and the enduring global struggle for justice and self-determination. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into such a pivotal moment in history. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations of the stories that shape our world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next video.